Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. My name is Ahmed Moor and I'm a fellow at the Foundation. Today is November 11th, 2025, and I'm delighted to be here with Annelle Sheline. Annelle is a research fellow at the Middle East program of the Quincy Institute. She previously served as a foreign affairs officer at the U.S. State Department's Bureau of Democracy and Human Rights and Labor's Office of Near Eastern Affairs before resigning in March 2024 in protest over the Biden administration's participation in the genocide. I'm pretty sure I mangled the State Department office title. Um, but welcome, NL, to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Ahmed. I'm an avid listener, so it's great to be here.
NL, when I first wanted to reach out to you, this is probably around the resignation, I searched my inbox to see if we had corresponded anytime in the past 15 or 20 years. Because it's a fairly small world. And I found an email from you, Cairo Scholars 2012.
You're kidding.
Yeah. So I'm just, do you mind kind of just providing an overview of how you ended up so immersed in the world of the Middle East and focused, I guess, on humanitarian affairs, um, and then explain what you were doing also at the State Department.
Sure. Well, I don't think I have access to the email address I would have been using back in 2012. So that is really fun. I'd love to see that. But yeah, just, a bit about me. Like a lot of millennials, the Middle East featured very prominently in my awareness. Kind of, I was in high school when 9/11 happened and decided after graduating, it was like 2008, the economy was falling apart, and I moved to Egypt and worked as a journalist for a couple years, worked at the Daily News Egypt, where I think a lot of Americans had the opportunity to work with that amazing staff there. And then decided I wanted to come back and do my PhD focused on the Middle East. And after that was fortunate to be hired at the Quincy Institute, which at the time was just a new think tank that was pushing for a less militaristic U.S. foreign policy. And having spent a couple years in the Middle East at that point, I was very much on board with the idea of less U.S. militarism in the Middle East and more broadly. So worked there for a few years before joining the State Department, where I, as you mentioned, worked at the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, which no longer exists. It was taken apart under Trump 2 and Marco Rubio. And was there not for very long. I'd only been there for about 6 months when October 7th happened, and initially thought this was an opportunity to, I'm here at the State Department, try and do what you can from this position. So sent various dissent cables over America's illegal support for Israel in the aftermath of October 7th, as it became increasingly clear that we were violating all kinds of U.S. law by continuing to provide, again, any support would have been illegal, but just the massive amounts of support that the Biden administration was sending to Israel. One interesting tidbit on this that I haven't seen getting much attention, at least not in the US, although I do think it's gotten some attention in Israel, and it was an Israeli that drew my attention to this, was the fact that under Biden, there have been like various reports coming out from things like the Cost of War Project about the almost $18 billion that the Biden administration sent in security assistance. So these are mostly just weapons, free weapons that the U.S. was providing to Israel in that first year after October 7th, 2023. And the narrative has been that because Biden temporarily postponed that one shipment of 2,000-pound bombs, the narrative was, Biden imposes arms embargo on Israel. And one of the first things Trump did was to send in these horrific bombs. He lifted the postponement on those. So the narrative has been, by Trump is like the best friend Israel's ever had. But what's interesting is actually in another recent report from the Cost of War Project, Trump has actually taken security assistance back down to the
Mm.
3.8 billion, which is still massive and larger than what the US gives to any other country. Um, but but it's not 18 billion or nearly 18
Right.
billion the way Biden did. And
Yeah.
this I was trying to dig down into this a little bit, kind of like, well, what does this really mean? And part of it may just be due to the fact that there's so much in the pipeline to
Mhm.
Israel that it's not necessarily kind of an indication that Trump is I wouldn't want to give someone a false impression that Trump is not fully supportive of Israel. He absolutely is, as is demonstrated by his policies. But thus far, we are actually seeing him not giving the scale, the inordinate scale of support that Biden gave, all these billions of dollars of free weapons.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean that look, I mean that resonates with me. I'm not a Trump guy. Um, but I would say that the Trump policy has been more transactional and less ideological based on where I sit as compared to Biden. And that to me also provides an opening, right? When things are transactional, you have a basis for contesting the economic value or the or any other kind of value associated with that transaction. Whereas the Biden people seem very ideologically committed. And one of the things that I've seen repeated endlessly is that things have gotten worse for the Palestinians in Gaza under Trump. Um, but I want to contest that idea. Like the famine, for instance, um, crescendoed under Trump, definitely, but was building under Jacob Lew and Joe Biden. And that absurd, revisionist foreign affairs article, I think, also illustrates the extent to which people are engaging in revisionism. So I appreciate your bringing that up as well, that the Biden administration really was the full-throated support. And we're going to talk about the Huffington Post report that Akbar Shahid Ahmed recently published. But before we get to that, I want to learn a little bit more about you, if you're okay with it. So, what is your day-to-day like as a human rights officer? Is that the right word? At the State Department. I mean, what is the practical work you do? And then what's the hope in doing that work for you at the individual level? Like, why are you there?
Yeah, well, and again, the Bureau doesn't exist anymore. But at least while I was there, a huge part of what our office did were the human rights reports that people may remember, the ones that they used to come out around kind of March or sometime in the spring. And it was about the previous year. This year, they were finally released in August and significantly reduced, really a shadow of their former selves. Um, and again, now it's really unclear how they're going to do them next year. They are congressionally mandated, so ostensibly the administration is going to have to figure out some way to produce some version of them, even with sort of the skeleton crew staff that remain. Um, so that process, when I joined the State Department, I didn't have a lot of illusions about US foreign policy, but I assumed it would be useful for me to get to sort of see how the sausage is made. And I'd also gone in with the assumption that my the extent to which that there would be conflict, I anticipated would come from engagements with foreign governments, a meeting with the representatives of the Algerian foreign ministry, or having a meeting with the Moroccan embassy or something, that would sort of be the point of friction, the
And
US
then what's your
government.
responsibility in that meeting? Sorry to interrupt, but I just want to drill down. You would air some American perspective on human rights violations to the Algerian king or the foreign minister, and they would get really unhappy about it.
Well, I wouldn't, but our DAS, our Deputy Assistant Secretary, if so. So a big part of work at the State Department is for these sort of interactions, developing the talking points. And so a lot of different offices are involved. That you have like the main desk officer is overseeing this, but bringing in the different offices. And so if we're lucky, they want to include some points about human rights. So this is the
Mm.
point I was making was I thought that the friction would be sort of in those engagements with foreign governments, but often the friction was with other people at the State Department who didn't want us to bring up a particular political prisoner or, a particular human rights issue because they were more interested in their objective, which was facilitating the relationship. They didn't want to throw sand in the gears. They wanted to increase cooperation with whichever Middle Eastern country it was.
Mm.
And the underlying generator of so much of this are weapon sales. And I wrote a report for Quincy that came out in April called Under Primacy, Weapon Sales Will Always Supersede Human Rights, because so much of our foreign policy, especially in the Middle East, but also around the world, the real objective is about maintaining American military primacy, which we largely accomplished through weapon sales, but also military relationships and military training and all kinds of other um, sort of mill engagement. Um,
And this is a bipartisan project, isn't it? The
100%. I mean, it was particularly maddening because Biden campaigned on the idea that he was going to, put human rights at the center of his foreign policy, in contrast to Trump, who, as you said, was much more transactional, was going to be was less ideologically driven, tends to be less ideologically driven. And then to kind of, look under the hood at the actual human rights offices within the State Department to see that no, they're marginalized. We had to fight to get ourselves heard at all. And usually it was more it was largely performative. It's sort of, you mentioned the human rights thing. They maybe say something in response, pointing out America's, hardly spotless record on human rights, or other illegal actions like the invasion of Iraq.
Mhm.
I mean, like the sort of it's a very patronizing attitude, a lot of sort of the human rights discourse that tends to come from the United States, which is in many ways, although I do think it is unfortunate that um and I know it's going to be challenging for groups like human rights and civil society groups in the region depended on the human rights report to say, look, the US government is paying attention. I know that may be difficult for some of these groups to no longer have that. But at the same time, I think it is more intellectually honest for the position that, yeah, human rights do not drive US foreign policy. Let's not pretend like they do. And let's
Mhm.
stop kind of lording it over other countries and pretending like we are so high and mighty and moral and superior.
Yeah, and so I'm glad you brought up Biden's campaign promises. It was directly in response to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Wouldn't meet with MBS, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, the crown prince, de facto ruler of that country. Um, but he was also a part of the Obama administration during the Arab Spring when Obama signaled, I think his first foreign policy speech was in Cairo.
I was
Uh,
in Cairo for that.
yeah,
It
right.
was it was so exciting because everyone, was so ready for the end of the Bush era and this, an end to the unnecessary wars. Like, people were really excited. People like Egyptians, people I knew and
That's right.
were so excited. And then I think very quickly it became clear that not much was actually going to change.
Right. So there was the coup and then ongoing weapons sales, which of course is security for the 79 peace with Israel, which came out of the war in 73. And so that kind of military relationship has defined the U.S. interaction with the Gulf, with Egypt. What about Jordan? I mean, you wrote a big policy analysis, I suppose. Jordan on the edge, pressures from the war in Gaza and the incoming Trump administration. So the U.S. relationship with Jordan is also defined through security assistance, also defined through the Jordanian-Israeli peace. What does Jordan look like? I mean, you went in person during the genocide, visited with policymakers. What is the relationship with Jordan like through the genocide, and then what does it look like today?
Yeah, so Jordan was a country where I had done field work for my dissertation. So was able to go back last year to sort of get a sense of, because the narrative in Jordan has long been, Jordan's on the edge, it doesn't have enough water, it doesn't have the resources, it takes on all these refugees, it's willing to do so, but we need more foreign assistance in order to continue to play this role as sort of a refuge from what are often US driven, you think about all the Iraqi refugees that escaped the US invasion and occupation, but then also, the horrors of the Syrian civil war. And so the Jordanian government very much relies on that narrative of you foreign governments, US, EU, Gulf countries must send us money or we'll fall apart. And it's sort of like, okay, well, now things are really on the edge in Jordan, just given the stress and pressures of a year, at that point, a year of genocide in Gaza. While I was there was also when Israel invaded Lebanon in early October of last year, and then Iran responded with,
We're in Amman.
yes,
Mhm.
Iran responded with, the volley of missiles aimed at Israel. I mean, this was prior to the so-called 12-day war that happened this past year in June. This was still kind of the somewhat choreographed sort of exchange that we had seen in April of 2024 and then again in October between Iran and Israel. But it was for Jordan, again, this narrative that they are sort of perpetually in need of foreign assistance. That was something that had been challenged under the first Trump administration, where, as you mentioned, that the U.S.-Jordan relationship really expanded after Jordan agreed to the 1994 peace treaty with Israel. And Jordan, after Israel and Egypt, has subsequently been kind of the third largest recipient of U.S. security assistance, excluding assistance that went to Afghanistan and Iraq, sort of at the height of those conflicts. But Trump threw some of that out the window. He didn't really see Jordan as necessarily such an important player. I think he was much more interested in the interests of the Gulf countries, as you said, transactional, kind of what can these Gulf countries do for me personally, and also for the United States. And so when Biden came to power, King Abdullah was the first foreign leader to visit and made many subsequent visits to try to sort of reestablish the importance of Jordan in the eyes of US policymakers. Um, and
And
then,
what's the argument there that we're helping suppress Al-Qaeda and ISIS and a lot of people may not be aware of this, but during the civil war in Syria, there was ISIS activity in Jordan, kind of at the border there.
yes.
But is that the argument basically? Oh, and we also help support stability on the border with Israel.
Yeah, so this is what my dissertation got into, was looking at the narrative of moderate Islam and Jordan as one of the first countries to embrace that back in 2005 with the Amman message, which was
Mhm.
sort of the idea was countries in the Middle East US partners used this to signal their compliance with the US security agenda, and to also that was sort of the external messaging, and the internal aspect was often about going after the political opposition, which tended to be Islamist in a lot of these
Mhm.
countries as a result of sort of post-Cold War pressures, whereby the left had been really decimated in the again sort of sponsored by the United States, going after any sort of leftist activity. Um, so the narrative had long been, whether it's in Jordan or Egypt or elsewhere, if you don't support me, the strong man ruler, whether president or king, the alternative is the Islamists. If you have democracy here, the scary Islamists are going to take power. And that really resonated well, that argument went really far in the aftermath of 9/11. And I think what's been so interesting in the past couple of days is to see the new president of Syria, very much an Islamist, former designated terrorist, which, we could get into sort of the problems with terrorist designation. But, again, this is someone who I think in the aftermath of 9/11, there's no way this individual would have been welcome to Washington. And so I do think
And
it,
you're being very polite in saying it. I mean, there was a $10 million bounty on this guy's head for being
yeah,
a child, basically.
yeah, no, and I feel like I have done a lot of like research into the ways that sort of this idea of terrorism is just such a bogus idea. But in his case, yeah, this person was involved in violent activity. And now, here we are welcoming him in Washington.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that I mean, I think Syria should be given the opportunity to come out from these crippling sanctions that have mostly just decimated the, you know, life for.
I'm totally with you. I mean, I understand exactly what you're saying. It's just the fundamental honesty of the Trump administration as compared to everybody else.
Right.
That we're going to do what we want to do because we can, because we're America, and all of this other stuff is a talking point that we can use as a cudgel to beat, China over the head with, maybe.
Totally.
Um,
Totally.
but but so Abdullah's trying to assert his indispensability during the Biden administration. He's visiting the U.S. a lot, and then the outbreak of the genocide, and then what?
Exactly. Exactly. So what I heard from people in Jordan was, it had always been a cold peace with Israel. Jordanians were not in favor of that peace agreement, but Jordanian leadership at least felt that they could trust that there were Israeli leaders who shared an interest in maintaining the peace treaty. It served both of their long-term interests to not be at war with each other. And they said the difference was in early 2022 when this new Israeli government of extremists and former designated terrorists like Itamar Ben-Gvir, they no longer trusted that that Israeli government was not interested in war or would not, in fact, um, forcibly expel Palestinians from the West Bank into Jordan in a way that would violate the peace treaty and then would put Jordan in this impossible position. Do they respond to that militarily, or do they just sort of take it and take it on and therefore deal with the repercussions domestically, which would likely result in the fall of the monarchy? That it
Hmm.
was very unlikely that the Jordanian population would tolerate that.
Hmm.
Um, or, I mean, I guess the third option would be the level of repression necessary to quell the domestic unrest that would really just cement Jordan's already sort of descent into more authoritarian tendencies. So, basically, I was just arguing that Jordan really is on the edge here, and there is this concern, and it's an ongoing concern that what is the long-term plan for Palestinians in the West Bank? Probably Israel is just hoping to make life so awful for them that, and some of them do have Jordanian citizenship, can cross into Jordan um, when the King Hussein crossing is open. I mean, it has been closed for much of the past year. And this also gets into a related question, sort of this, I've heard a lot of people raise just their sort of confusion at the fact that we haven't seen more resistance from Arab publics in the face of the genocide. We've seen, the big protests in the United States or across Europe and just not necessarily, it just hasn't been quite as visible in the Middle East. And I think, the answer to that is the United States for decades has cultivated governments in this part of the world that are, that do not care about Palestinians, that are willing to sign, whether it's peace treaties with Israel or, things like the Abraham Accords. Rulers in this part of the world have long been willing to sort of use the Palestinians politically when it was useful to them, but not actually do anything to help them. And And then they are armed heavily by the United States such that they have a repressive security apparatus to go after the element, much of their own population that does feel, that has watched, long before Americans and Europeans were paying attention to what was happening to Palestinians, Arab publics have been paying attention and have been in anguish over it and have been, have been systematically disempowered from doing anything about it.
Exactly. And many of the draconian laws have existed for a long time.
Yes, yes, but I feel like it's the sort of question of why aren't we seeing more resistance or demonstrations from Arab publics is quite ignorant of like the decades that the US has spent investing in authoritarianism in this part of the world in to serve Israel's interest in maintaining or Israel's perceived interest in maintaining the occupation.
Exactly. And civil society is largely hollowed out. And I think in Jordan as well, you had the aftermath, like you mentioned earlier. I mean, Jordan is a state of refugees, right? I mean, half of Jordanians are Palestinians originally. Excuse me, you had a big influx of Iraqis, as you mentioned, after the 2003 war on Iraq, and then subsequently the civil war in Syria. I think Jordanians may have also been, 2011, there was a lot of enthusiasm around protest, popular protest, and the possibility of a different kind of government or regime change. And Syria erupted in civil war, and I think soon after the war in Syria started, the protests in Jordan around that time abated, and people kind of looked around and said, "We don't need that here. That is not a better outcome for us." And so that's
Totally.
also, there's no protest against the genocide which isn't going to be harshly repressed, and we saw that in some instances. The next stage is to escalate, and nobody wants to escalate.
Yeah. No, totally. And I think that wasn't just limited to Jordan. I think a lot of Arab publics saw what was happening in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, and decided that, if that's, if it's either we continue to tolerate our dictatorship or we descend into the horrors of war, we'll take the dictator, which I think is probably something a lot of people would have decided. And then in addition, just, the countries where there was a transition failed. Even Tunisia, while I was at State, was in the context of Kais Saied taking over. Well, he was already in, he'd already won the election, but was really consolidating power. And it was getting some attention within DRL because Tunisia had been the sole democracy to emerge from the Arab Spring, and the US had been in, had like tried to support civil society groups there, um, and it was just sort of another. I think there were, again, just sort of the incompatibility between, like on the one hand, you have the United States like working with Tunisian security forces on like terrorism. And it's like, yeah, well, as you're empowering the security forces, those also are then used against the population. Like you can't have it both ways. You can't both prop
Mm.
up the sort of mechanics of authoritarianism and then also think that by like sending some minor amount of like support to civil society that like you're also going to get democracy. And this is part of what was so maddening for me at the State Department was like the numbers of people who believed strongly in human rights and believed in the US as supporting human rights and, very much bought into the notion that, the alternative is, authoritarian China, the US is better. And it's like, yeah, but what are we actually supporting here? I mean, look at like the balance of what US resources go to. Like it is ludicrous to think that like the vast amounts of weapons and security assistance, just like the scale of what the US does to prop up dictatorship in the Middle East and elsewhere around the world, in contrast to these sort of piddling amounts that the US provides for civil society. Like we're not it was just
That's very much
frustrating.
right, and that's very much the story in Jordan, where there's a new indication, I guess, about what the Jordanian leadership believes the Israelis are going to do. I don't know, you must have seen in August of this year, Jordan reinstated mandatory military conscription after 30 years of having suspended that. And it's hard to see that and not interpret that as preparations for the ethnic cleansing of the West Bank, if it comes to that. I don't want to say that that's a done deal, but certainly there are, Israeli ministers, the government today talking about ethnically cleansing the West Bank has accelerated the ethnic cleansing there. So how do you interpret the this I guess reinstatement of the military conscription? Is that one more stage? What is Jordan's strategic value to the United States at this point, after having talked about, where you're going to absorb a lot of Palestinians?
Yeah, well, it was interesting that when Trump cut off foreign assistance to basically all countries, Egypt and Israel were exempted, and Jordan wasn't. Um, until then, it was. I think initially Jordan was somewhat shocked that it was included. It didn't get the Israeli or Egyptian exception, but then later, security assistance to Jordan was quietly reinstated. So I do think that the Trump administration has some understanding of the fact that if there were a different government in Jordan, it would likely be less amenable to carrying out U.S. and Israeli interests. Um, but that being said, that didn't stop the Trump administration in the first term from talking about, apparently there were discussions of would Saudi Arabia be given control of the Christian holy sites, Christian and Muslim holy sites in Jerusalem, which Jordan remains the custodian of nominally. I mean, Israel exercises the actual control, but um, and that's something that for the Jordanian monarchy is very much a red line. They're
Mhm.
as the Hashemites, that's a huge part of their sort of remaining grip on their religious authority, as much as it is. Um,
And Hashem's interesting. I mean, this is just an interesting thing I learned recently. The Prophet Muhammad's grandfather, so Hashem, it was actually buried in Gaza.
oh
He
wow.
died in his 20s in Gaza. I learned this just reading John Pierre Philew's Gaza history.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Um, yeah, and so of course that's where the Hashemites come from. They believe that they're descended from the Prophet, and they derive a whole lot of legitimacy on that basis.
Right. Theoretically, I mean, I don't know to what extent, inside Jordan at this point, they're necessarily viewing Abdullah as, some paragon of Islamic virtue.
Mhm.
But right, it is central to their legitimating narrative, at least.
Mhm. Okay, so let's go back to excuse me, to profiting from the genocide. So you've highlighted the the arms companies, the fact that the United States does robust sales in the Middle East and across the world. The State Department, I mean, these are my words, not yours, acts as kind of the clearinghouse and also sales representative for U.S. arms dealers. And forgive me if that sounds a little bit harsh.
Not
Um,
at all.
but then there are also private companies in the mix, and you just wrote a report for the Arab Institute, I believe.
Arab
Uh,
Center.
sorry, Arab Center, which is going to be published either today or soon, and it describes who's profited in the private sector. Could you explain what you found there?
Yeah, so essentially, Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in Palestine, published this groundbreaking report over the summer, which was extremely comprehensive and well researched. Um, and she focused on three categories. It was the corporations that benefit from the displacement of Palestinians, their replacement with Jewish Israelis through illegal settlements, and then the entities that enable these crimes through narrative construction and knowledge production. And, she went through, just the vast amounts of the world economy, these massive corporations, things, everything from the obvious ones like the weapons manufacturers, Lockheed, Palantir, Raytheon, to let things that perhaps were once less obvious, Google, Amazon. Um, and in the report, she identified several additional sectors that she just didn't really have time to go into. So there's the legal, consulting, media, and advertising sectors. And so in this report, I was trying to draw to kind of dig into that additional those sectors that haven't gotten or that hadn't gotten really much attention in her report. And this is in no way comprehensive, but was just trying to in particular focus on how consulting firms and media and advertising firms have responded by trying to enable Israel's ongoing occupation and genocide. And in particular, as it became clear that Israel was losing the narrative. And so I talk about, in particular, in the aftermath of Israel cutting off all aid into Gaza on March 2nd, and then as it became clear, the images coming out of starving children, and as we'd already talked about, like the the Biden, like there was malnutrition and concerns about famine under the Biden administration. I mean, this is something that my colleague Alex Smith, who resigned from USAID, has written about extensively, just as we were saying, to kind of not memory hole the fact that Biden was responsible for sort of allowing Israel to not allow in aid, even though they like to talk about the fact that, they convinced Israel to allow in aid, but sort of normalizing this idea that they would cut off funding for UNRWA, for example, based on what have now been demonstrated to be inadequate evidence, that Israel's allegations of like UNRWA staff's involvement in October 7th, the ICJ ruled that that was false or, not.
Well, yeah, all the reports are circumspect and they use very careful language. They say things like inadequate evidence, but I mean, from my perspective, it's just bogus, made up stuff.
Exactly. Exactly. Totally. And also that even and sort of like bracketing that regardless, Israel still has to provide,
Hmm.
like under international law, it has to provide, it cannot starve a population under its control, like,
Hmm.
regardless of anything UNRWA did or didn't do.
Hmm.
Um, so all that to say, like, so again, Biden is to blame for sort of setting so much of this in motion. But things did get worse when Israel blocked anything from coming in after March 2nd, when the ceasefire was nominally still in place, until they like fully abandoned it by, I believe, March 18th. Um, so, and then, and what I found so maddening was that we like somehow it was acceptable to bomb Palestinians indiscriminately. But once we started to see them starving, that galvanized so much opposition. And the way I sort of get into the piece is that Israel's enablers had been successful in creating this narrative of, Hamas is using Palestinians as human shields, which is
Hmm.
also bogus. But this idea that there was some kind of military necessity, that this was collateral damage, and that the American public had grown somewhat accustomed to that in the context of the war on terror, that, a certain number of civilians were going to be killed in the effort to kill terrorists.
So
Um,
Hamas schools, Hamas hospitals, Hamas ambulances,
right,
Hamas cameras,
right,
uh, and then there's enough doubt there
right.
for.
That it was sort of rendered somehow justifiable. Whereas there was really no way for Israel's apologists to explain starving babies and blocking baby formula other than the annihilation of this population.
Mhm.
So anyway, and then you have like the creation of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which itself came out of, the US and Israel created it to essentially manage this narrative. It wasn't actually intended to save lives, as eventually became clear. But it was supposed to push back against the idea that Israel was starving everyone in Gaza, which they very much were. But that you had organization or companies like the Boston Consulting Group, which is one of kind of the big three consulting groups.
Hmm.
The other two are McKinsey and Bain, that signed on to do this, to sort of launder Israel's reputation in this way. And eventually, as the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation became just such a PR fiasco and sort of failed to accomplish its mission in shifting the narrative, you did see some reputational damage for the Boston Consulting Group. You had, I think, Save the Children canceled their contract with them. But a lot of other big aid organizations didn't, including UN organizations like the World Food Program. So their damage was really not that significant. Um,
As you're talking, and this is kind of tangential to the central point about the privatization of war profiteering, or maybe that's anyways. But what's striking to me is how complete the Israeli direction over successive American administrations has been, or appears to be. I mean, you remember the floating pier off Gaza, which was also a fiasco. Later emergence
exactly.
that that was an Israeli plan.
Totally.
GHF is an Israeli plan. And
Totally.
so, what explains the degree to which U.S. efforts designed to, ameliorate, and I'm doing air quotes here, Palestinian suffering are ideas hatched by Israeli propagandists, and I'm showing all my cards here. I'm not an impartial person. Hatched by, Israeli propagandists and people who seek to reinforce the genocide and ethnic cleansing. Like, what explains that?
I mean, and some of that I think is a broader political story that for so long, it reflects the power and wealth of the Israel lobby. Um, but I also think some of it does have to do with these institutional relationships, the fact that the United States is accustomed to working so closely with the government of Israel. Whereas the only thing we really have to say about the Palestinian Authority is that they need to reform, which they do, but their lack of reform, or the need for reform, has a lot more to do with the way Israel has used them as sort of the subcontractors of occupation, and in other ways just murdered any possible future leader that could emerge, to sort of unify the Palestinian people. But again, so like the U.S. has no real, like, does not have a working relationship with the PA the way it has had these decades of collaboration and partnership with Israel, and also just so many of people sort of in these positions of power are very committed to Jewish supremacy in Israel, and to sort of the Zionist, that form of Zionism, of Jewish supremacy. And the in sort of drilling down to things like Ambassador Satterfield as managing the humanitarian response in Gaza a few years before, when he took over the Baker Institute, where I did my postdoc. He had this big event about Israel's, I think, 75th anniversary that drew protests from like pro-Palestinian student groups at Rice. And, I mean, it was just so baldly
Hmm.
pro-Israel. And like, this is the person Biden put in charge of like caring for the humanitarian, of like caring for Palestinians in Gaza, for like in charge of the humanitarian response. Um, so it's like personnel is policy. You think about Brett McGurk being so central to Biden's foreign policy.
Hmm.
Brett is someone who is extremely anti-Iran, anti-Islamist, very pro-UAE, very pro-Saudi, very pro-Israel, and very anti-democracy. Um,
Hmm.
and I mean, Biden obviously bears a lot of responsibility himself, but given the state, the fact that Biden's senility was increasing over the course of his presidency, I do think a lot of the blame or the responsibility does fall to those around him.
Right. And that's a really powerful idea, I think, personnel is policy. And it helps tie all of this together, right? I mean, the the conveyor belt, I guess, or maybe turnstile from private sector to public to private, the way that people in the defense industry go into government and then come back out and secure essential contracts helps explain GHF. It helps explain why Brett McGurk now is a venture partner, I guess. It's some weird, I think, UAE-backed venture fund, which is in the defense industry. And it helps explain the privatization of the genocide in the way that you describe in the report. But just real quick on the propaganda. I mean, you talk pretty extensively. There are now budgets, $150 million budget that the foreign ministry in Israel has allocated to propaganda, what they describe as, or what they call hasbara. In your estimation, is this working? Is it going to work? Um, where is rubber meeting the road for the Israelis on their public relations efforts?
I I think that there was a recognition that Israel had really lost the narrative, and rather than although, as you just said, Israel is still investing in massive amounts of money in Hezbollah. It has more to do with censorship now and things like Larry Ellison and several other billionaires buying TikTok to the nominal concern had been, China has access to this platform, but it was really about, you know,
Mhm.
pro-Palestinian messaging on TikTok. Um, and, you know,
Well, what are policy circles like? I mean, you live in DC, you work in a policy shop. The people you interact with, what's that conversation like? And is this public relations effort, the censorship effort, really likely to work, or have things moved too far, uh, based on what people have witnessed these past 2 years?
I think it remains to be seen, and I'm reminded of something a Palestinian colleague said to me, which was, as soon as we stop dying, people are going to stop paying attention. And unfortunately, Palestinians have not stopped dying. Israel has killed, I believe, 250. I don't even know what the number is, but in the past month of the so-called ceasefire, continued to bomb, not allowed in aid. Like the genocide is continuing. It's just sort of at a, a lower burn. Um, but the narrative has been there is a ceasefire. We're not, it's a shaky ceasefire. It's a fragile ceasefire, as opposed to just no, Israel violates it at will, and then like pretends like it's still abiding by it. Um, but again, like all of this pressure that had been building in Europe, in this country to finally do some actual take measures to hold Israel accountable, whether it's divestment, whether it's, actual sanctions, whether it's, um, various somewhat symbolic things, but like kicking Israel out of like FIFA or the Eurovision competition. So all that pressure has evaporated. And because there's this idea that like now there's a ceasefire. And so I think that the it's an open question of, will people who for the past 2 years have been watching a live streamed genocide and responded by taking to the streets and pushing for divestment and pushing for concrete action, will people continue to pay attention, or will this sort of censorship and this effort to sort of rehabilitate Israel's image, is that going to work? Um,
I share your questions around that. I mean, but to the extent that we have a new vocabulary, a new framework for understanding Israel, is that shared amongst your colleagues and people you interact with? If you use words like Jewish supremacy and ethnic cleansing is the goal, is that understanding contested by anybody that you interact with and on kind of an average basis across the DC policy world?
oh, I mean, I do think that the parameters have really shifted. And I remember, I think it was Muin Rabani who said that he was like, remember when people didn't even say the word Palestine as like a place? He's like, we had to start from so far
Or
down.
even occupation. Yeah.
Right. Like I do think that just sort of the vocabulary and people like the Overton window has shifted. Um, and so I don't think you can really put that back in the bottle, but I do think that there is a concerted effort now by these the paid propagandists, as well as like the ideological apologists, to posit that, things are just gonna kind of go back to normal, just regular old low-level genocide and occupation as opposed to all-out sort of Holocaust. Um, and I don't know, like I think it's just my perspective in Washington is very influenced by kind of where I'm sitting. I'm not in government anymore. Um, I'm surrounded by people for whom this is never going back to the way it was. But the Quincy Institute is not calling the shots.
Mhm.
Um, and unfortunately, the Trump administration, again, has the personnel in place are people like Mike Huckabee and just like the extent to which they are so in bed with the Israeli government and see those interests as aligned. But even that's being challenged. So sorry, one more thing. I mean, just like the way that this is incompatible with an America First agenda of how can we be America First if there's a big asterisk for but except when it comes to Israel. And I do think so many young conservatives are aware of that inconsistency and calling out the administration on it. Um, I mean, I was shocked yesterday to see Laura Loomer tweeting that she thought the US should end all aid to Israel. And her argument was so they can kind of just kill anybody
Yeah.
they
Trying
want
to
to.
square a circle there.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
But how I think I interpret that is maybe more that she sees the writing on the wall of where the party and, a lot of kind of America Firsters are on this issue.
Mhm.
Um, so, I do think that because Trump is not so ideologically committed to this, that there is a possibility, and things like the United States, building a military base in historic Palestine, or taking over aid distribution um, inside Gaza. I mean, I think from like the Quincy Institute's perspective, there's a big concern about the US increasing its military commitment to this region and again, sort of Israel outsourcing the occupation to the US and to other, whether it's Egypt or, various other countries that might contribute force troops to the internal stabilization force. Um, at the same time, I think I think just so many of us are like, well, anything's better than just the horrors of Israel just continuing to annihilate Palestinians in Gaza. Um, but yeah, I do worry a lot that like attention is just going to go away and all of this pressure that had been building to really fundamentally change policy towards Israel, not just views of Israel, but um, you know,
And that, that leads us to the um, next point in the discussion, which is the Hague Group, the quest for accountability. Would you talk a little bit about your involvement with the Hague Group, what you witnessed? I believe you attended one of the gatherings.
yeah,
What is the
so
Hague Group designed to do? It was
yeah, so
in January
the
2025. Sorry, go ahead, please.
yes, exactly. So yeah, it was established, co-chaired by South Africa and Colombia, and originally, I believe, just had six other members, all of them from the Global South, trying to hold to sort of fulfill their obligations under international law, under the Genocide Convention, under the ICJ's ruling on the illegality of Israeli occupation, to end their any sort of relationship with Israel, to pressure is but the challenge is that a lot of these countries don't have a significant relationship with Israel.
Mhm.
What we really need are countries in the EU or the United States to adopt a different policy. And so you also had the Madrid group, for example, that was more, obviously EU focused. But I was able to attend the sort of emergency meeting in Bogota that Colombia hosted in July, where ultimately I believe it ended up being 27 countries attended, um, and which adopted these six measures of, arms embargo on Israel, don't allow your any arms bound for Israel to transit through your ports, adopt universal jurisdiction to go after war criminals, Israeli war criminals, and others. Um, and then there was also a meeting on the sidelines of UNGA in September, where you did have the foreign minister of Brazil, like very, again, momentum was building, and especially at UNGA, you had, these various countries, including now four out of the five permanent members of the UN Security Council recognizing Palestine, but that didn't really translate into anything real on the ground. So
Mhm.
while the recognition of Palestine, I think, was mostly intended as like a pressure release valve to say, we
Right.
did something without actually doing anything.
And
Um,
so do you believe that the Hague Group has legs, that there's going to be, I mean, obviously these countries are important. They represent a large portion of humanity, but not big trading partners of Israel, don't share a border with Israel. So where does this go in your mind?
my What I have been working on at the Quincy Institute is to try to make it a bigger tent so that, even if a country is not going to adopt the full range of measures against Israel, that they still want to be officially counted in sort of like this coalition
Mhm.
opposing Israeli occupation and genocide. And so that they could sign on to sort of symbolic measure, concrete or symbolic, but sort of that there would be options to register your official opposition, even if the government wasn't going to sort of sign on to this sort of like top tier level. But that really does have to come from the states. It's not something um, that civil society can do. I mean, this has to be decisions that states make themselves at the official level. And while I plan to continue to sort of work with the Hague Group and support their efforts, again, it is part of what I was saying about my fear that now the pressure has really just evaporated, and you don't, attention is shifting partly because they are censoring this information and like, putting Barry Weiss in charge of CBS, and just like totally controlling the narrative because they know they can't really shift it anymore. So now they're just going to not allow, and this is part of, the systematic campaign to murder journalists inside Gaza, is to make sure that this information does not get out.
Right. And to be clear, Larry Ellison, who purchased Paramount, you mentioned in the report, is the largest private donor, and he's the person who appointed Barry Weiss, or his son is the largest private donor to the Israeli army. Shares lots of interests with the Israeli government.
And is a
Um,
close friend of Trump, and so I do
right,
think a lot of this also goes to kind of, and Mohammed bin Salman is about to come to Washington next week.
right.
Anticipate
And a Gulf consortium
boatloads of
Gulf
new.
participated in the consortium to buy TikTok as well.
Yeah, the UAE did. I don't know if I hadn't seen if Saudi Arabia did. But certainly, I mean, the degree of cooperation and just personal enrichment that the Trump family, just the corruption of.
Yeah. There's a rich irony here, which, in the cynical view, international humanitarian law, and I'm a cynic today. International humanitarian law is crafted to extract compliance from all of these third world and developing countries, and now they're the ones who are clamoring for its enforcement and for its being upheld in order to protect the weakest amongst us, and um, I don't know what it means, but it is ironic. My last question to you kind of circles back to your resignation. And I mentioned earlier this report in the Huffington Post by Akbar Shahid Ahmed. Biden discussed, this is the title, Biden discussed potential Israeli war crimes in Gaza. He kicked the can to Trump. The big revelation here is about Blinken using the term ethnic cleansing, about Brett McGurk arguing in quote emotional terms that Israel shouldn't be sanctioned despite, evidence of war crimes. And then somebody talks about this is a revelatory statement, but Biden officials worried that attaching their names to a recommendation to limit American support for Tel Aviv would hinder their future career prospects, the former senior official said. And then that person is quoted as saying, which is in itself appalling. So you gave up a career in the State Department. You know how hard it is to get a job. I mean, PhDs come out of programs, finding a high quality job, which is stable, which allows you to sustain, mortgage payments for 30 years, send your kids to college. That's a big deal. To what extent is genocide compliance, this is my last question, but to what extent is genocide compliance explained by careerism? I think it's been an underreported story. But what was your experience of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a very accurate way to describe it. But I think that you have a lot of self-delusion where people are willing to stay in the job, stay in their role at state or, some other aspect of the foreign policy apparatus of the US government, because they think, well, I can't have an impact on the policy now. I have to wait until I'm, senior enough. I've got to work my way up and then I'll have an impact. And it's like, no, you won't, because like at that point, you have the fancy job, you've had all these connections, for you to like turn your back, and call out your colleagues it is, that's your community to like burn your bridges at that point in your career is really uh, people are accustomed to the power, and I think they tell themselves this story, and you hear this from like people like Samantha Power, for example, that her justification to herself was, I can do more good in my role than my resignation would do. And it's like, what do you mean? There was almost no aid getting in. Like you were not having your presence there was not like having enough of a benefit. And so many people tell themselves that, including, colleagues that were working on human rights, that maintained this sort of self-deception that, well, it's important that I continue to do this work. It's like, no, because you continuing to do that work is is complicity. Like it's you walking through the door says that you're okay with what's happening. And and so whether it's, someone at a more junior level who's telling themselves that they just have to stick it out until they can make a difference, or someone at a senior level telling themselves, it's better I'm in this role than, someone else who doesn't, understand it the way I do or won't be able to, make these minor differences. It's like, okay, so maybe you got some shipment in that wouldn't have gotten in otherwise, but like in the broader context, I mean, this goes back to what we were saying of like you look at the actual effects of what's happening, U.S. Security assistance and like the outcomes that drives in the region, which is, autocracy, just like a very dysfunction. I don't want to say the whole region is dysfunctional, but just kind of U.S. policy towards the Middle East continues to drive violence and autocracy, such that you telling yourself that you working on whatever your little issue is, whether it's human rights or aid or whatever, like you have to look at the overall effect of what the US government is doing and ask yourself if you want to continue to sort of enable that, or do you want to be the person who speaks out against it? And I think for me, I just couldn't look my, and I've talked about this, that a big part of it was about I always, it was about my daughter. Um, and so I just don't know. How a lot of these officials can can like look their kids in the eye.
Annelle Sheline, thank you for humanity, your humanity. I mean, in all of this, it's people like you who've given me inspiration. I mentioned that I'm cynical. I'm cynical about the policy, but your decisions throughout the genocide, and your work, which continues, really do, you know, provide inspiration to me and others. So I'm grateful to you for that. And thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. Like I said, I'm an avid listener. There are so many amazing guests, and you're such a great interviewer. So really appreciate having the chance to speak with you about some of these things.
Thank you.